The transatlantic slave trade represents one of the darkest chapters in human history. A brutal system that forcibly displaced millions of Africans and fundamentally reshaped the world. Its origins can be traced to the early 15th century, when Portuguese explorers first began to venture down the West African coast. Initially, their interest was in gold and spices, but they soon saw the potential for human trafficking. The first enslaved Africans were brought to Portugal in the 1440s, marking the grim beginning of a centuries-long tragedy. This early trade was relatively small-scale, but it established a horrific precedent and a network of contact. Spanish colonization of the Americas created a voracious demand for labor, particularly after indigenous populations were decimated by disease and exploitation. European powers, including Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, established trading posts along the African coast. These forts, such as Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana, became holding pens where captured Africans awaited the dreaded Middle Passage. The trade was not a simple European imposition. It involved complex and often coercive relationships with African kingdoms and traders. Some African states actively participated, exchanging captives for European goods like guns, textiles, and alcohol. This influx of firearms destabilized the region, fueling wars and creating a vicious cycle of violence and enslavement. Captives were often prisoners of war, or simply individuals kidnapped from their villages in brutal raids. They were marched for hundreds of miles to the coast, shackled and suffering immense hardship. The journey to the coast was a filter of death, with many perishing from exhaustion, starvation, or violence before ever seeing a slave ship. Once at the coast, they were subjected to humiliating inspections, branded with hot irons to signify ownership. Families were torn apart, their names and identities stripped away as they were prepared for the transatlantic voyage. The Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic, was a nightmare of unimaginable cruelty. Ships were packed far beyond capacity, a practice known as tight packing, to maximize profit. Enslaved people were chained together in cramped, dark, and unventilated holds. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, excrement, and death. Disease, particularly dysentery and scurvy, was rampant, spreading like wildfire through the packed bodies. The mortality rate was staggering, with estimates suggesting that between 15 to 25% of Africans died during the voyage. The psychological trauma was immense, as individuals were surrounded by the sounds of weeping, moaning, and the ever-present rattling of chains. Acts of resistance were common, ranging from hunger strikes to violent uprisings, though they were usually brutally suppressed. Those who survived, arrival in the Americas brought no relief, only the beginning of a life of forced servitude. They were sold at auctions, poked and prodded like livestock, and sold to the highest bidder. Once on plantations, they were forced into grueling labor, cultivating sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee under the constant threat of the whip. The working conditions were brutal, with long hours under a scorching sun and inadequate food and shelter. Life expectancy was short, and the system was only sustained by the continuous importation of new captives. The plantation economy of the New World was built entirely on the backs of this enslaved labor. The immense profits generated from these cash crops fueled the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Banks, insurance companies, and shipping industries flourished as a direct result of the slave trade. The wealth of nations was being built upon the suffering of millions. Despite the dehumanizing conditions, enslaved people found ways to resist and preserve their humanity. They developed rich cultural traditions, blending African customs with new influences. Music, dance, folklore, and religious practices became vital forms of expression and spiritual survival. The sound of the drum, though often banned, was a powerful link to their African heritage. Spirituals and work songs contained coded messages of hope, despair, and plans for escape. Resistance took many forms, from slowing down work and feigning illness to sabotage and running away. Maroon communities, settlements of escaped slaves, were established in remote areas throughout the Americas, from the swamps of Florida to the mountains of Jamaica. These communities represented a powerful defiance of the slave system, a beacon of freedom in a world of bondage. Major slave revolts, though often unsuccessful and met with overwhelming force, shook the foundations of the slaveholding societies. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791, stands as the most successful slave rebellion in history. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, enslaved and formerly enslaved people rose up to defeat the French, Spanish, and British armies. The establishment of the independent Republic of Haiti in 1804 sent shockwaves across the world, inspiring fear in slave owners and hope in the oppressed. The movement to abolish the slave trade gained momentum in the late 18th century, driven by a coalition of abolitionists, religious groups, and formerly enslaved people. Figures like Olaudah Equiano, whose autobiography detailed the horrors of his enslavement, became powerful voices for the cause. Activists like William Wilberforce in Britain campaigned tirelessly in Parliament to end the trade. In 1807, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, making the trafficking of enslaved Africans illegal in its empire. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron was established to patrol the coast and intercept slave ships. However, the abolition of the trade did not mean the end of slavery itself. Slavery continued in the British colonies until 1834, and in the United States until 1865. The United States officially prohibited the importation of slaves in 1808, but a thriving domestic slave trade continued for decades. The American Civil War was ultimately fought over the issue of slavery, a bloody conflict that led to the emancipation of 4 million people. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, finally doing so in 1888. The end of slavery did not bring an end to racial oppression. Newly freed people faced immense challenges, including systemic racism, economic exploitation, and political disenfranchisement. Systems like sharecropping and convict leasing in the American South created new forms of coerced labor. Jim Crow laws enforced strict racial segregation and denied African Americans their basic civil rights. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is deep and far-reaching, continuing to shape our world today. The economic disparity between the developed West and many parts of Africa can be traced back to this era of exploitation. The trade underdeveloped Africa, draining it of its most valuable resource, its people. It created a legacy of political instability and violence that has persisted for generations. In the Americas and Europe, the trade embedded racist ideologies that were used to justify the brutal system. These ideas of racial hierarchy and white supremacy have proven stubbornly persistent, fueling discrimination and inequality. Social and political structures of many nations were built upon this foundation of racial division. The fight for civil rights in the 20th century was a direct response to the enduring legacy of slavery. The cultural contributions of the African diaspora have profoundly enriched the world. Genres of music like jazz, blues, gospel, reggae, and hip-hop all have their roots in the experiences of enslaved Africans and their descendants. These musical forms are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of cultural expression. The diaspora has also made immense contributions to literature, art, cuisine, and religion. The psychological impact of slavery continues to be felt through intergenerational trauma. The memory of slavery, the loss of ancestral identity, and the ongoing experience of racism have left deep scars. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame, but about acknowledging a shared and painful past. It is essential for comprehending the complexities of modern society, from global economic patterns to contemporary race relations. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is a story of immense suffering, but it is also a story of incredible resilience. It is a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty, but also its unyielding struggle for freedom and dignity. The echoes of the rattling chains can still be heard in the persistent inequalities of our time. The profits from sugar and cotton built empires that still stand. Cultural fusion born in the crucible of slavery has reshaped global arts. The political boundaries and conflicts in modern Africa often reflect the disruptions of the slave trading era. The legal frameworks that once defined people as property have left a legacy of systemic bias. The diaspora communities in the Caribbean, North America, and South America are living testaments to this forced migration. The very DNA of populations was altered by these centuries of movement and interaction. The philosophical debates on human rights were profoundly shaped by the abolitionist struggle. The wealth of port cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes was directly tied to the triangular trade. The agricultural landscapes of the Americas were permanently altered to produce cash crops. The resistance of enslaved people provided a blueprint for future liberation movements. The historical narratives taught in schools are still grappling with how to honestly portray this period. The language we use to talk about race and identity is a product of this history. The patterns of urban segregation in many cities have their roots in post-emancipation policies. The global economic system continues to reflect the power imbalances established during this era. The fight for reparations for slavery is a contemporary political issue born from this history. The preservation of African spiritual traditions in the diaspora is a form of cultural survival. The stories passed down through families carry the memory of this traumatic past. The architecture of plantation houses stands in stark contrast to the invisible histories of the slave quarters. The development of modern capitalism is inextricably linked to the capital generated by slave labor. The concept of race itself was constructed and solidified to justify the institution of slavery. The international laws against human trafficking have their origins in the fight to abolish the slave trade. The collective memory of this period continues to be a source of both pain and strength. The struggle for racial justice today is a continuation of the struggle that began on the shores of West Africa centuries ago. The trade connected continents and network of exploitation. The demand for labor in the mines of South America also fueled the trade. The introduction of new diseases had a devastating impact on both sides of the Atlantic. The clothing worn by Europeans was often made from cotton picked by enslaved hands. The sugar in their tea was a product of immense human suffering. The tobacco they smoked was cultivated through forced labor. The moral compromises made by nations have had lasting consequences. The scientific racism that emerged in the 19th century sought to legitimize the system. The art and literature of the period often romanticized or ignored the reality of slavery. The voices of the enslaved, recorded in narratives and testimonies, provide a powerful counterhistory. The archaeological study of slave shipwrecks offers a tangible connection to the past. The genetic mapping of African Americans can trace lineages back to specific regions in Africa. The political activism of the diaspora has had a global impact on anti-colonial movements. The creation of Creole and Patois languages is a result of the mixing of cultures. The culinary traditions of the American South are a blend of African, European, and indigenous influences. The fight for educational equity is linked to the historical denial of education to enslaved people. The environmental impact of plantation agriculture is another lasting legacy. The psychological toll on the enslavers themselves is a less explored but important aspect. The economic models that prioritize profit over human life have modern parallels. The global conversation about human rights is incomplete without acknowledging this history. The resilience of African cultures in the face of systematic attempts to erase them is a powerful story. The memory of the ancestors who endured the Middle Passage is a source of inspiration for many. The ongoing work of historians and activists is to uncover and tell the full story. The quest for justice and reconciliation remains a central challenge for the modern world. Trade was a global enterprise, implicating nations and individuals across continents. The legacy is not just historical. It is a living presence in the institutions and attitudes of today. The fight for a more just and equitable world is inextricably linked to confronting this past. The story is a stark warning about the dangers of dehumanization and unchecked greed. It challenges us to build a future where such atrocities are never repeated. The final abolition of slavery in the 19th century was a victory for humanity, but the struggle was far from over. The dawn of the 20th century saw the rise of new forms of colonialism and racial discrimination. The civil rights movement in the United States was a direct challenge to the legacy of Jim Crow. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. drew upon the legacy of abolitionist protest. Independence movements in Africa and the Caribbean in the mid-20th century sought to undo the colonial structures left in the wake of slavery. The Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s emphasized cultural pride and self-determination as a response to centuries of oppression. Today, movements like Black Lives Matter continue to highlight the persistent systemic racism that is a direct descendant of the slave trade. The conversation about reparations for slavery has gained new momentum in the 21st century. Scholars continue to uncover new details about the lives of enslaved people, giving voice to the voiceless. Museums and memorials are being built to ensure that this history is never forgotten. The digital age has allowed for the creation of vast databases, tracing the voyages of individual slave ships. The descendants of both the enslaved and the enslavers are now grappling with this shared history. The process of healing from such a profound historical trauma is a long and complex one. It requires truth, acknowledgement, and a commitment to justice. The impact on global demographics is undeniable and permanent. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is a fundamental part of the story of the modern world. It is a history that belongs to everyone, and one that everyone must confront. Acknowledging the full scope of its horror is the first step towards true reconciliation. The journey towards a truly post-slavery world is still ongoing. The lessons of this era must be learned and relearned by every generation. The fight for freedom is a continuous and universal struggle. The echoes of this past will continue to shape the future for centuries to come. The final chapter of this story has yet to be written. It is being written now, in our collective response to its enduring legacy. The world we inhabit was forged in the fires of this brutal trade, and its shadow lingers still.